Here's our testimony from Dr. David Fowler. He's a forensic pathologist testifying for the defense here and ultimately offering his opinion that George Floyd died as a result of cardiac arrest or cardiac arrhythmia caused by a combination of police restraint, his heart condition as a primary cause of death, and then secondarily influenced by things like drugs and perhaps carbon monoxide exhaust from the exhaust of the car that he was next to and other underlying factors. And we just heard Fowler walk us through a little bit about why he came to this conclusion, placing a lot of emphasis on George Floyd's heart, the fact that the heart was enlarged and some narrowing of George Floyd's arteries. I want to go over to Alex Brachet, who's outside the courtroom. And Alex, there was an interesting part where Fowler talks about George Floyd's size and how that relates to the size of his heart. But first, I want to play a quick clip of just Fowler offering his ultimate opinion in this case.
So before we begin, Doctor, can you summarize briefly what your opinions are in this case?
Yes. So in my opinion, Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, or you can write that down multiple different ways, during his restraint and subdual by the police, or restraint by the police. And then his significant contributory conditions would be, since I've already put the heart disease in part one, he would have the toxicology, the fentanyl and methamphetamine. There is exposure to a vehicle exhaust, so potentially carbon monoxide poisoning, or at least an effect from increased carbon monoxide in his bloodstream, and paraganglionoma, or the other natural disease process that he has. So all of those combined to cause Mr. Floyd's death.
So there you have it. That's Dr. David Fowler. He's a forensic pathologist, again testifying for the defense, offering his opinion that George Floyd died as one of the primary conditions of his cause of death was his heart disease, not just law enforcement restraint. And again, I want to go to Alex Brachet, who's live outside the courtroom, with a little bit more on Fowler and some of the things that came out of his testimony, Alex, as he elaborated on this. One of them was him explaining that because George Floyd was a big guy, that you would expect him to have a big heart, but that even when you factor that in, he was in the 95th percentile. And so for Dr. Fowler's standards, he says that puts him in the category of an enlarged heart.
That's absolutely right, Diane. And actually, Fowler talking about George Floyd's size does two things, right? We've heard the defense already try to lay the groundwork that Derek Chauvin felt like he was potentially outmatched or overpowered with George Floyd in his use of force. Dr. Fowler, again, highlighting George Floyd's size as being a large individual, someone that he would expect to have a larger than an enlarged heart. But also, in saying that, I mean, there are other causes here for his heart to be enlarged, pointing to the use of methamphetamines. It really starts to kind of muddy the waters. And you heard earlier the questioning about the five manners of death, be it a homicide, a suicide, an accident, or undetermined. And the defense really trying to lay the groundwork for the reason why a homicide may have been listed in that autopsy report, but also noting that there's a part one and a part two in terms of causation there. It's really trying to lay the groundwork for potentially muddying the waters for cause of death for George Floyd.
And I want to bring in Terry Austin, host and legal analyst at the Law and Crime Network, for a little bit more on this. Terry, I found part of Fowler's testimony also interesting because as he's talking about George Floyd's size and how he's in the 95th percentile, he describes it first as the top end of normal before he then says, bottom line, he had an enlarged heart. And it reminded me of the testimony that we heard from the prosecution's witness, who was a cardiologist, saying that some might consider George Floyd's heart to be slightly enlarged. Some might even consider it normal. And now we have the defense's witness kind of using both of those words in that description.
Well, that's right. And you might see that what I think we're trying to get here is a cardiologist might look at the heart a little different. You saw Fowler try to explain the difference between how a forensic pathologist might look at an enlarged heart or the narrowing of the arteries, while a cardiologist might look at it a little bit different because they're looking at live patients. I think the important thing here that the prosecution needs to do when they ultimately do the cross is one of the things Fowler said was there were a million different reasons that contributed to the death of George Floyd. He talked about the enlarged heart, the cardiovascular disease. You mentioned it too, Diane. He even talked about carbon monoxide, which is the first time I've heard that. He talked about stress, anxiety, adrenaline. There were multiple different contributing factors here. But the doctor also said that for the heart to die, this necrosis, that it has to be, to see necrosis, you would have to see that. He called it a sudden death. And he said, this is a sudden death. And so to see the necrosis, you'd have to have a longer time period. And that didn't exist here. And that's why we're not seeing the necrosis. So he's trying to say basically that all of these contributing factors led to this sudden cardiac arrest. Whereas the prosecution is basically saying, yes, we know he has a bad heart. We know he has narrowing of the arteries and he has this drug use, but he's been living all along with all of these conditions. It was only because of the subdural restraint and compression that caused the death. So I think that's the distinction between what Fowler is doing and what the physicians on the prosecution's case were doing.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear him kind of explain why a cardiologist might see the narrowing in Floyd's arteries as being okay, because cardiologists might see a lot of patients who walk around and they're fine with a 90% blockage, let's say, whereas forensic pathologists, they see the people who died, and to them, 75% starts the risk factor. So then you look at Floyd's 90%, and he's concluding that that may have caused, in the words of the defense attorney, which Fowler agreed with, sudden death. The other part that you mentioned there, and you hit on this, was the carbon monoxide part. We haven't heard that in this testimony, in this case at all. But if one of the factors in George Floyd's death was carbon monoxide from being next to a car exhaust pipe, doesn't that go back to blaming Derek Chauvin and the police?
Diane, once again, you hit it on the head. No doubt about it. And I'm certain that Nelson did not expect him to say that. Yes, they left the car on and it was running. And we've heard that evidence before, that the car was on for a long time, that George Floyd was placed on the street side, all of these issues that might actually lead back to the fact that the police officers, and Chauvin in specific, were part of the cause of George Floyd's death. So the fact that this car was running on battery or however it was running, carbon monoxide was going the whole time. He was in the prone position. His face was close to the ground. Absolutely, that would be another contributing factor. And you could appoint that to the fact that the police officers put George Floyd in that position. So I think when we hear the cross-examination, the prosecution is going to pick up on that. We picked up on it, so I think the jury may have picked up on it. And that's going to have to be cleaned up by Nelson at the end of the day when he does his summation.
And Terry, you heard Alex Prochet there talking about the reference to Floyd's size in the context of this conversation. We actually have a clip of when that came up. I want to play that for you and get your reaction.
And Mr. Floyd was a very tall, robust-looking individual. So I would expect him to have a larger heart. And so the type of study, such as the Mayo study, where they put in the sex of the individual, male, the height and the weight, and then come out with, as part of that calculation, accounting for that, the 95th inclusion rate would top out at 510 grams in this circumstance. So Mr. Floyd's heart weight at 540 is outside this range. I will tell you there are multiple studies. There's another one out of Chicago and Northwestern University, which has even broader range and would indicate that Mr. Floyd was within the 95 centile, but still right up at the very top end of normal. Bottom line is he has an enlarged heart.
So, Terry, that was a very long explanation there to get to that bottom line that Fowler is concluding that Floyd had a large heart. But this aspect of comparing him, you know, if you were to take a male who was 5'5" and only 120 or 130 pounds, you know, him sort of painting this visual picture of a smaller man who you would expect to have smaller organs versus Mr. Floyd, who was large in size and he called robust. Is there a strategy there to try to remind the jury, remember, this was a big guy, since that's part of the defense's defense here, that Derek Chauvin had reason to use force against George Floyd because of his size?
Well, that's a good point. And I think you recall the prosecution was saying that is not a threat, that it might be a risk factor, but it's not a threat just because you see someone who is large, just because you see someone who obviously they don't know it's an enlarged heart. But the point is, if you see an individual who might be bigger than others, it doesn't mean that you use force against them. So I do think they're trying, Nelson here is attempting to say that this is a robust individual and that perhaps the officer should have been more alert and more cautious and used more force. But I think it's working against them because the bottom line is everyone does have a different sized heart. And the enlarged heart is just part of the fact that George Floyd was a large man and he worked out and his heart was larger than our hearts might be. That doesn't necessarily mean that contributed to his death. It was all of these other issues, the compression and the restraint that caused his death. At least that's what the prosecution is saying. So I don't think Nelson's focus on the enlarged heart is helping, and I don't think Fowler's testimony in connection with the large heart helped. I think the jury is thinking, okay, he's a big man and he had an enlarged heart. Next.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.